As promised, I'm here to read one of the long-form sections from the book May It Be So, and I hope that this can be, as it has been for me actually in years past particularly, a way to step into Lent, a way to investigate, to excavate your heart. What I did with the long-form sections of this book, as I explained in the video that was previous to this yesterday, I think, that instead of looking at the Lord's Prayer, this thing we call the Our Father or the Lord's Prayer, instead of reading it and just working through it the way I normally do, just kind of praying it, I wanted to see what the words themselves did or were doing in me as I prayed them, because I think that's a way to understand language in a religious context. Yes, it's important to know, like, what was the Greek, what was the Hebrew, what was the Aramaic, all that stuff is important. Also important is, what do these words do in us when we say things like fellowship, when we say things like worship, and we say things like prayer, love? What actually happens in us? What do we mean by that? Part of what we mean by things, part of how we define words, part of why words are important, it's not just because of what gets transferred between people, but because of what gets unearthed in us as we hear or use words. And so I want to begin with the beginning. This prayer that Jesus offered his disciples when they asked him, how do you pray? Teach us to pray. And he gave them this prayer that we call the Lord's Prayer, or we call the Our Father. And then it begins with those words. And if you know my story, you know it probably comes as no surprise that the word Father is where, like, for years, my soul stopped at the word Father. There's a whole lot there that isn't in this particular book. It's in other books. In recent years, it's the word Our. The word Our does some pretty interesting and particular work in me. And so when I pray the Lord's Prayer, the words Our Father, specifically the word Our, does this. Here's the story from May It Be So. The first time I saw a therapist, I parked in the lot adjacent to the therapist's office and walked toward the entrance with my sweatshirt hood pulled up, covering my head and part of my face. I took the stairs instead of the elevator and walked quickly through the hall to the office door. The way I generally heard it talked about, therapy was something only frail and lost people needed. I didn't want to consider myself broken or weak. Perhaps more to the point, I didn't want others to think that of me. Closing the door behind me, I pulled my hood back down to find that I'd been joined by 4 other people in the waiting room. The gray-haired woman to my right looked up from her magazine, smiled, and removed her bag from the chair next to her. She gestured to the now open seat. You can sit here. In other words, you are welcome here. We'll make room for you. By the time I actually sat on the couch to talk with the therapist, the knots in my soul had been in were already coming undone. I spent most of that session actively and finally confronting lies in myself about being too strong to be weak, about being too needed by others to have needs of my own, and about how not having my life together meant losing my place in line. This work didn't just start when I sat across from my therapist. It actually started when I was invited to take a seat among the people in the waiting room. And I began to believe I'm welcome here. They've made room for me. I'm often compelled to pray because circumstances have convinced me that I am alone in my struggle, and that the only honorable way to move ahead is to do so alone. These trials are mine. The burdens are mine. These fears are mine. I have them and they have me. These lies begin to unravel with the words, Our Father. I'm invited to see myself as part of the family of God, which means I can choose to see the burdens I carry as burdens also carried by others to whom I belong, sisters, brothers, mothers, fathers, neighbors. When I pray Our Father, I join countless family members who share the same entanglements, frustrations, joys, dreams, and hopes that often lead me to pray. I'm not alone, neither are you. You can sit here too. Please do. And even if you parked across the street, and walked with your head down and your face covered because you weren't sure you wanted a place among the people who do this kind of religious thing. You know, and should know, that you are welcome here. You have a place. We will make room for you. Our Father,